EWA Radio, the podcast of the Education Writers Association. I'm public editor and your host, Kavitha Cardoza. Going from reporter to editor is seen as inevitable if you want to move up the journalism ladder. But what is that transition really like? How do you know if you're suited to being an editor? What are some of the factors you need to think about? Andrew Ujifusa and Daarel Burnette have been longtime education reporters. Andrew covered the Department of Education, Congress, and national education policy for years. Daarel covered all things school funding. They're two of the most accomplished reporters I know, and also two of the nicest. Both recently transitioned from reporters to full-time editors. Daarel is senior editor at the Chronicle for Higher Education, and Andrew is Chalkbeat story editor. I'm thrilled to welcome both of them to EWA Radio. Hi, Daarel. Hi, Andrew.
Hey, Kavitha.
Hi, Kavitha.
I have never heard the story of how both of you became education reporters or why both of you stayed on the beat. And the reason I ask is oftentimes education reporting is seen as a first beat on the way to something else. How did both of you get into it?
My first full-time reporting job was in Mississippi. I was working in a small paper, and I covered everything: local government, crime, features, you name it. And I also covered education. And it became clear to me over time that other stories occasionally might get more attention, be more sensationalized, what have you. But the thing that people most consistently cared about was what was going on in their schools, what was going on with the school board, what was going on with people leading their schools. And so I think I've just taken that with me as I've progressed throughout my career. That's stuck with me, and that's a big reason why I'm still in education journalism today.
Daarel?
This has a very intimate EWA connection, actually. My undergrad, when I was at Hampton University, I had a professor who met his wife at an EWA conference. And this is really random, but this is very real.
Okay. Interesting.
He was dating her at the time, and now they're divorced, unfortunately. But at the time, he had kept coming to class saying, I've been involved in this EWA conference. I met this wonderful woman there. She's an education reporter at the Virginia Pilot. And he had a theory at that time that he said specialty journalism is going to be the thing of the future. So you should just pick what you want to cover now. And so I come from a long line of educators. My great-grandmother, my grandmother, my parents are all educators. And so it just seemed to make sense to become an education reporter. And I think it was the best decision I've made in my life.
Is that the real answer, Daarel, or were you just thinking, hey, I'll go for EWA conferences and meet someone?
That's very, very real.
That is a way better story than mine. I will freely admit
very real. They don't have this anymore. I wish they did, but they used to have student memberships back in the day. They were free. And so I was like a student member way, way, way back in the day.
Well, now it's even better because regular members are free.
Yeah, exactly. Everybody gets in free. At that time, it was like, you got to pay a yearly. My professor kept saying to me, come on, like memberships are free. All you got to do is fill out this form. So, yeah.
So both of you have broken tons of stories and you understand policy and money on a very, very granular, like wonky level. And I say that as a huge compliment. Why did you decide to become editors?
A big part of our job, right, is supposed to be about public service. So there's a lot of like celebrity now in journalism, but we're supposed to be focused on other people. It's not like working at a food bank per se, but like we're supposed to be offering assistance to the community. So to me, if you spend enough time as a reporter and you enjoy it, a lot of us at some point think we can extend that idea of helping people to fellow reporters. Reporters need help and support too, they need love too. That's like a lot of professions. Like you work with different types of bosses, you pick up different practices and things you want to emulate and things you swear, mercy, I'll never do that if I'm ever in his shoes or whatever. Part of it was just like wanting to teach people without like helping them improve, without being like a pedantic or a bore. Did that make sense as an answer? I hope so.
Yeah, it did. But now I'm feeling super selfish, Andrew, because I feel like I can't imagine myself an editor, because every time there's an awesome story, I'm like, I want to report it. I don't want anyone else to report it.
No, I mean, the idea of like it being a public service, like part of the attraction of the job is supporting people who do that frontline work. And, you know, it's not like that desire like completely goes away. Like, I think every editor worth his or her salt is like, hey, that's a heck of a story. Go get it, you know? And then you're like, there's a twinge of like, I remember when I was doing that, you know? And like, it never goes away, and that's natural. That's probably healthy. Part of it, too, is just wanting to test yourself, I think, and be in those secretive daily editors meetings, right? Who doesn't want to be in those?
Where you plot to make reporters' lives miserable.
Don't say it. That's what everybody thinks.
Daarel, why did you make the transition?
I think as a reporter, I became increasingly frustrated with the decisions that news managers are making. And I say that about both the internal newsroom issues, like identifying stories, which reporters to hire, where to send reporters, et cetera, but then also like the financial decisions about the future of our newsrooms, how we make money, how we keep money, how we manage our money. I think those decisions have really gotten us to where our industry is right now. And I've always been kind of like disturbed and frustrated by that, and realizing that the people who are making these decisions are oftentimes like not passionate about the journalism. They're especially not passionate about education journalism. I also had a series of really, really bad education editors, not Mark Baumster, Andrew. Best editor I've ever had.
I wasn't going to say anything. I was not
Mark.
No way you met Mark.
But before Mark, I had a series of really bad education editors because, first of all, newsrooms don't really invest in leadership. They just don't. But also, they really don't invest in education editors. And education editors are like really, really rare to find. People who understand education. And most editors are really passive about it. And it used to really frustrate me because I would see how much attention that political reporters or crime reporters were getting, sports reporters were getting from their editors, you know, like super engaged in the story, super engaged in like the twists and the turns. And then with education, they just be so passive. So I really thought that education reporters need the kind of support and the development and the engagement level that other reporters get. And I just really over time just started to understand like the potency that the editing position has.
Mm-hmm. Oftentimes reporters get very frustrated with their editors. You know, they feel they're just cutting or rewriting, and God knows all of us have had those. Yet a good editor can just transform a story and see things that reporters don't. How do you think about your new role?
So as a reporter, like it's kind of your job. And in some ways it's easier to be inside your own head a lot of the time. You know the ins and outs of X and Y policy issues. Someone important is, you know, saying something mean about someone else who's important. Some powerful people are screwing something up. And here are the 17 ways they're screwing it up and how it impacts schools and students. Like, that's the core of what we do, right, as people who work in journalism, reporting that stuff out in a way that has impact. But I feel like a big part of my job with empathy is to understand what's going on in the reporter's head while making sure they're also thinking about other things that you know don't live quite so naturally inside their heads. Have you bulletproof your story so you don't get angry phone calls demanding corrections? How does this relate to other issues that readers might care about? Are you following our publication's guidelines or rules for a particular issue? You know, style, that matters. Like if you had to read your copy out loud to your intended audience, don't forget the reader, like would it make sense? One thing I've heard that's helpful sometimes is read your stuff out loud. How does it sound? People still process words that way. I think it's helpful to understand what's going on with reporters and inside their heads while still balancing that with those questions and those issues.
I think oftentimes like reporters think of journalism as a solo expedition. They take on more than they can actually chew, or they take on the responsibility of executing great journalism by themselves, like without any help. And I think that oftentimes like that's unfair. I think the best journalism is having a support coach who can help you see the trees for the forest or the forest for the trees, help you frame your stories, be the reader's advocate, help clarify, really kind of motivate in some instances. Writing is one of the more difficult forms of art. I sometimes think of myself as like a writer's therapist a little bit, just letting reporters talk through what they've learned, help them structure things. I think all those things are, key pieces of being able to execute great journalism.
Mm-hmm. What are some of the biggest differences between being a reporter and being an editor, and what didn't you expect or what were you surprised by?
One of the biggest challenges for me is how you process information about a late-breaking story or something unexpected or a change in plans. How you process that while other people are talking to you or watching is very important. There's this really stale stereotype, I think, of, like a newsroom where people are shouting and yelling at each other, and it's just like that all the time. It's utter chaos. I mean, actually, when I'm talking to colleagues, I like saying no drama. Just those two words. It's almost like a mantra. Like, this happened. What are we going to do? Oh my gosh, this changed. No drama. I picked it up from a sports podcast, actually, I listened to, where one person says it fairly often. And it's a way to sort of calm myself down, too. And in fact, maybe there is a little drama, or quite a bit. But often, like, it's a way to say, like, look, we'll talk about it. We'll figure it out without, like, Mount Everest collapsing, right? We'll get through it. How you deal with those situations as an editor, I think, is much more important than when you're a reporter and your hair is on fire. Like, it's sort of your job to have your hair on fire more. So, right? As an editor, I often find that's not helpful. And oftentimes it's not worth it. Like, in fact, the issue has a solution. Like, you don't want to go around killing cockroaches with a bazooka. So I think that how you present yourself that way is very important.
That's very real. The thing that surprised me the most, I think, are the amount of meetings. There's a lot of meetings.
Yeah, absolutely. And they're all of them are totally fun, totally awesome. Right?
It's like a series of decisions every day. Like just a lot of deciding, a lot of meeting, a lot of collaborating, a lot of like problem solving, which can be fun sometimes. Sometimes it can be a little bit overwhelming. And then also just managing personalities. I mean, people have different personalities and different ways of being motivated. So, trying to figure out what reporters need and when they need it, it can sometimes be a science.
I always think the editor can set the tone for his or her reporters. And often when you see how a reporter is doing, it kind of reflects on the kind of support they're getting from their editor. Both of you think a lot about diversity and inclusion and how to make newsrooms like a place reporters can give and be their best. I know we've had many conversations about this. Is there anything you're trying to do now that you are editors?
We have a lot of good conversations about diversity and equity and inclusion at Chalkbeat, the right way to deal with it with the public, with our readership, with colleagues. I don't know if there's one thing I would pull out of those, just that it's an ongoing conversation. I know that sounds like public relations speak, but it's true. And some of it is just about having respect for what people have going on in their lives that you can't see, but is there for everybody in some form. Known unknowns, I guess, is one glib way to put it, as someone once put it. When, as reporters and editors, we tell the stories of everyday people, there's a kind of duty to treat those people with dignity and respect, and even to honor them by telling their stories, right? And I think that approach is also helpful when thinking about colleagues and the different perspectives they bring to the table. And sometimes there are news events that bring those issues to the fore, where I've listened to colleagues talk about those issues in the context of their own lives and how they think about something difficult or troubling that's happening in the world. And they've been given the space to do that. And I really appreciate that.
I think I would answer this in two ways, because I think there's like diversity, equity, and inclusion in the newsroom, and then there's diversity, equity, and inclusion in your coverage. So when it comes to coverage, I just saw Matthew Delmont speak at Politics and Prose a couple weeks ago, and he wrote that book on how the media covered the busing integration. So I asked him, what he thinks about how the media is covering, today's civil rights efforts. And he pointed out that one of the things that he is starting to notice is that sometimes the media has gotten bored with writing about racism effectively. And he said this is like repeating this cycle, like in the early 1970s, after a lot of the big protests, Martin Luther King's assassination, integration, the race riots, that the media started to get bored with race. It was like, we've already written that story. And so one of the things that I think editors have a role, and that really kind of really articulated for me, sort of like the ability to kind of like keep issues of race on the front burner for newsrooms, but then also trying to find new and creative ways of writing about it and continuing to analyze and assess the language that we use. So an example of reporters getting bored with race issues is like using lazy words like woke, or like watering down the severity of disparities between different races, or sort of like not necessarily being as alarmed as we used to be on, the ways that communities are policed or the sorts of education that people are being provided, et cetera. So I have very strong feelings about the race beat in general, which is like an editor's decision is like, okay, we are going to have a beat in which somebody covers race explicitly and what that means for that beat and how they frame that beat. And so I think that that's one of the things that I've been thinking a lot about lately. And then within the newsroom, I could say this just from my own personal experience, but, when newsrooms tend to lack a lot of diversity is when they do not develop and push young reporters and are honest with young reporters about the things that they need to do to become successful in the newsroom.
What do you mean? What's an example, Daarel?
For example, this is like really basic, but when you're editing stories, are you giving explicit and transparent feedback? Are you saying, I'm making this change because of this? Or are you just rewriting the story?
Mm-hmm.
When a reporter comes to you with, sort of like a frustrating or exhausting day, or they've experienced something out in the field that is typical of what young reporters experience, is the editor saying, this is typical or atypical with how you handled the situation. Here's how you could have handled it differently. And I can speak for young Black reporters because I've been a young Black reporter. Young Black reporters typically don't kind of get that sort of advice and or mentorship. I say this all the time, like, we don't have a recruitment problem. We have a retention problem. We have a hard time keeping and developing young reporters of color. And so doing everything that we can possibly do to, when we bring these people into our newsroom, helping develop them and support them and, treat them equally, I think is just a constant fight that I think is an editor's responsibility.
I think absolutely right that Daarel pointed out that some of what's being talked about is an issue of who gets what and who doesn't get what in newsrooms, and being deliberate about it and being thoughtful about it. I think that's really important.
Andrew, you mean like opportunities?
Opportunities, but also who's told what about their writing, how, like, I'm thinking about, for example, like Daarel mentioned being clear and transparent about feedback in terms of reporters' actions, decisions they make when they're out reporting, as well as what they write. I don't know how other editors deal with this, but I think it's I mean this in the opposite way of condescending. I mean, I don't mean it's not condescending at all, the reverse. Praise is very important. Not just to get praise like, this is a great lead, or like, this nut graph really captures it well. And not just to tell reporters that, but to say why. Because while you never figure out the one true way to tell one big story, right? There are good practices and there are good habits that you can bring to every story. Even if you're writing a different perspective on a big issue, a different type of story, multimedia based, different voices, different time, whatever. Those practices are repeatable. And I think reporters should be told, like, hey, even if it's implicit, and maybe explicit too, carry that forward. Remember that. This is really good stuff. But, it goes back to what Daarel said about being transparent, because that's what we demand a lot of the time as journalists. So we should do it too.
I do agree with that so many times we as reporters are asking other people questions, and sometimes there isn't that same type of examination going on internally in our newsrooms or even as individuals. Both of you have always been different from typical reporters in the sense, even when you were reporters, you have thought very deeply about the state of education journalism as a whole. Changes in the field, how to adapt to new technology, funding. It's never just been about doing your stories and your work is done. How do you feel about what's happening with education journalism, given that there are stories of layoffs every single day?
Yeah, I'm part of a program with mentoring a reporter, and he works for Burnette paper, and they are doing buyouts right now. Yeah, it's rough out there in the field. And the thing that concerns me the most, especially when it comes to education reporting, is just the turnover. Like, one of the reasons why I think that the trust amongst the general public and the media has unraveled is because they don't see reporters on a day-to-day basis. They don't see like a face behind the stories. And I'm saying like stories that really resonate with them, that feel very personal to them. And the most personal stories, I would argue, are education stories, because school boards are some of the most intimate forms of democracy. It's something that everybody has a local school board. You feel like you can go to the meetings, you know who the school board members are, et cetera.
Mm-hmm. And you're entrusting your children.
Yeah, and you're trusting your children
system.
To the system. Yeah, everybody's connected to the school system in a very, very intimate way. And so that turnover and that inability for people to recognize who the local education reporter is and go to them with, all the problems that, education reporters are presented on a regular basis concerns me. The thing that I find to be compelling and fascinating about education on the flip side is that there are a lot of citizen journalists who are live streaming board meetings, who are setting up blogs, who are trying to fill the hole. And there are a lot of nonprofits that are trying to fill the hole. So I do think that now is the time that we can experiment with new forms of storytelling and new forms of letting people understand how you can hold school boards accountable, pushing the boundaries with, funding models, with storytelling models. I mean, the original system that we had before was not perfect. So now is an opportunity to fix it. So, I do see signs of hope a little bit.
This is supposed to be a public service in large part, right? So it's like, whatever unfair obstacles or new developments or some tech company, like whatever those throw up in the way of obstacles, it can also present opportunities. Like in Chalkbeat, we're working on, for example, a texting project where we text folks about what's going on at school board meetings. Is that going to get the biggest and most powerful venture capitalists in Silicon Valley excited? Probably not. But I'm intrigued. I think stuff like that is really great.
What would you tell a reporter who's thinking of making the change to become an editor?
There was some mug I saw a while back. It was, the never trust an editor. And I was like, hey, that's actually...
That's you now.
But I know, it's like, oh no, do people not trust you? If you like the idea of transmitting what you've learned over time to other people and helping people in a newsroom context, then it might be for you. And maybe like Daarel, you've seen a lot of stuff that's messed up in newsrooms, and you want to change that. But I do think you should think about how much you naturally get involved with other people in terms of support. If you have a lot of connections across the newsroom, outside of editorial, for example, that might be a sign, sorry, that you might be a good editor.
Mm-hmm. What about you, Daarel?
The first thing I would say is, if you do want to make the transition, I think you have to think through, are you okay with not getting public recognition? That's one of the biggest differences. Your name is on the masthead, but you don't get bylines. So you're really behind the scenes. Some people have passion for being behind the scenes. So if you're okay with that, that's great. If you're okay with wanting to, be supporting reporters, that's the one thing that I think is a little bit different about newsroom management than it's about other types of management, is that other types of management, you're kind of leading people. In newsrooms, I kind of see myself as kind of supporting the reporter. I described to one of my reporters, I'm your secretary. I'll run around and get the photo assignment and make sure all the stuff is in order so you can execute journalism. So, removing all the barriers to journalism. If you have a passion for framing story ideas, problem solving, that is all things that I think are prerequisites. But then once you've decided, okay, yeah, I want to be an editor, then I would suggest trying to think of opportunities in which you can show your leadership skills in the newsroom. Being explicit. Most reporters are not explicit about where they want to go, what their goals are, etc. So being explicit with a manager about, this is what I want to do, what do I need to do to get there? And then trying to be part of story idea brainstorming sessions, which takes up a lot of time. It's trying to think of how we're going to do projects, how we're going to roll out a series of stories, how we're going to assign beats, etc. Taking opportunities to be involved in those conversations and pitching ideas to the editors as to how they can do their jobs differently. I think editors actually should at least appreciate that.
Thank you both so much for being on EWA Radio. So the reason I wanted both of you on, and especially this episode to air during the Thanksgiving week, is I feel both of you are so generous with your knowledge in newsrooms. You all have been so thoughtful in your stories and as colleagues. And I've just had such a great time working with both of you. And I'm really, really grateful for that and for so many other education reporters and editors. So thank you very much for being on.
Oh,
thank you so much, Kavita. That means a lot.
You can follow Daarel Burnette and Andrew Ujifusa on Twitter at Daarel and at Andrew Ujifusa. That wraps up this episode of EWA Radio. I'm Kavita Cardoza. Do you have any questions for Andrew or Daarel? Let's continue the conversation on Twitter at EdWriters. Special thanks to Angelina Liu and Kristan Obang from EWA and Raul Garcia for production assistance. The mission of the Education Writers Association is to strengthen the community of education journalists and improve the quality of education coverage. For more than 75 years, EWA has helped reporters get the story right. Thanks for listening and lifting up education journalism.